So I'm also really excited to be here and be involved as part of this launch for this Centre, Centre for Science and Philosophy. And I'm particularly excited because there are so many people here at the launch event. I'm sort of excited about what it's going to be like with this in the future, but with this many people supporting it both inside and outside the university, I think it's going to be really exciting to be involved with. Unfortunately, I've not started so well by making the same mistake that Eleanor made and getting the title of the centre wrong, but we'll move on. So my talk's going to be, to some extent, the odd one out of the four, and that's partly because there are two sorts of questions that we ask in philosophy of science. One sort of question is about particular sciences, so philosophy of physics, or philosophy of biology, or philosophy of cognitive neuro experimental psychology. And those you've already heard quite a bit about, and there are other sort of philosophies of out there as well. Philosophy of maths, for instance, as James said, was where I started off working. But now my interests are more in the second sort of question that we ask in philosophy of science. And these are general questions, questions that to some extent arise in all sciences. And the particular ones that I'm interested in are questions about general methodology of science. And in particular, how we reason in science. So what's the, as philosophers call it, the epistemology of science? That is, how do we reason towards the particular conclusions that we have in science? And I'm particularly interested in a certain sort of reasoning under uncertainty. So this is exactly the sort of reasoning that, in fact, we carry out in science. This is reasoning where we're not reasoning that we do when we're not certain what sort of world we live in, when there are sort of competing hypotheses between which we're trying to make a decision, and we have evidence supporting one or the other to differing degrees, and we've got to try to decide how to weigh up that evidence to come to some sort of conclusion. And actually, that's not sort of limited to the philosophy of science. And so the way that I look at this question is not limited to just asking what the methodology of science is or what this reasoning under uncertainty is that we do in science, but also the sort of reasoning under uncertainty that we do in our everyday lives as well. And here are just a couple of the sorts of general questions that we're interested in this area. We're interested in trying to identify general principles that govern good reasoning under uncertainty. So we're sort of interested in finding the canons of good reasoning when that reasoning's sort of probabilistic reasoning or reasoning under uncertainty. And another sort of question is how, for instance, our evidence affects what we should believe about the world. So how should our uncertainty change in response to different sorts of evidence that we might get? So what I want to do is, first of all, persuade you that there's an interesting question to be asked here. And the way I'm going to do that is try to persuade you that we're not terribly good at reasoning under uncertainty. This is not the sort of thing that human beings, it turns out, are particularly adept at. And I'm going to give you two examples of where we're not, and ways in which we do this poorly. And in the first case, I'm going to sort of present it to you, and then sort of explain in a slightly hand-wavy way why what we in fact do is wrong and what we should do is something different. And in the second case, I'm going to do a similar thing, but I'm going to try and go a bit further. I'm going to try and explain exactly what is wrong with what we in fact do. And that's the sort of question I'm interested in sort of philosophy of science, epistemology of science, methodology of science, is trying to justify these general principles of reasoning that we try to use. Okay, so here goes with trying to convince you, first off, that we're not terribly good at doing this. So take the following sort of situation. A mystery disease is discovered, and it just affects people in a population of 60 million, for instance, the UK. And you know through some sorts of techniques that you know how many people are infected. 6,000 people are infected, but you don't know who. And this is a problem because although you've got a treatment for this disease, it's a costly treatment, you don't have very many samples of it, and you need to know how to distribute it. But that's okay because we've got a test for the disease. We've got a diagnostic test, blood test or something like that, that can test for the disease. But like all medical tests, this is not a perfect test. It has some flaws. And there are two sorts of flaws that a medical test or any sort of test can have. It can have a certain false positive rate, and it can have a certain false negative rate. So the false negative rate is the proportion of people who have the disease for whom the test will give a negative result. So it falsely gives a negative result. And the other sort of failure that a test can have is its false positive rate, and that is for people who don't have the disease, the proportion of those who will get, it will give a verdict of ill, give a positive verdict falsely. So suppose the test we have is pretty good, or it seems pretty good. It has a false negative rate of only 1%, false positive rate of only 1%. Okay? So things are looking good. And then we give Jane this test. Jane's one of this population. But that's all you know about her, that she is one of this population. You give her the test, and it turns out she tests positive. And then the question arises, how confident should that result make you that she has the illness? So it's late on in the evening. Everyone's been sitting down for a long time, so we're going to have a pop quiz. A, you should be 1% confident, so I'm really not very confident at all that she has the illness on having tested positive for it. B, 50-50, doesn't really give you evidence one way or the other, just you sort of split the difference. And, or C, you're very confident, you're 95% confident. So hands up, who would say A for this? Okay, hands up, who would say B? An unpopular choice, it turns out. And C, 95%. Okay, so this is the problem with giving this test to a room full of scientists. It's always one of these high-risk strategies, giving a talk, if you're basing the rest of it on a particular outcome. So it turns out actually about half people said 1% there, and about half said 95%, and there were a few people on the 50% margin. It turns out that the answer is 1%. So sort of half people got that right, and half people didn't, of people who answered it, and I think some people were abstaining from that vote. So I'm going to explain to you why that should be the case. But the typical answer that people give in this sort of situation is 95%. Someone tests positive for disease. This looks like a very good test. 1% false negative, 1% false positive. Most people say, okay, that gives you very good reason. I should be pretty confident of that, 95%. Here's why you shouldn't think that. Here's why you should think 1% instead. So the easiest way to think about this is to imagine the tests were done on every single person in the population. Okay, so what's that population like? It's got 60 million people into it, splits into two groups, one of whom are ill, one of whom are not ill. So 6,000 of whom are ill, and the rest are not ill, so 59,994,000 are not ill. And then imagine how those groups separate into those who test positive and those who test negative. So first of all, take the people who are ill. You do the test on them. You know it has a false negative rate of 1%. So 1% of those people will test negative even though they're ill. So that's 1% of 6,000 will test negative, 99% will test positive. So those are the numbers. What about the people who are not ill? Well, there's 59,994,000 of those. And in this case, and we have a test with a false positive rate of 1% as well. So that means that 1% of those will test positive, even though they're not ill, and the rest will test negative. And that gives those numbers. So what does this tell us about Jane, who tested positive? Well, all we know about her is that she's on this side of the diagram. We know about her that she's positive. So how confident should we be that she's ill on the basis of having tested positive? Well, a plausible thing to say is that you should line up your level of confidence with the frequency with which people who are ill test positive. And if you do that, then it turns out that the frequency is just that. It's the number of people who are ill divided by the total number of people who test positive, which is less than 0.01%. The problem, of course, with this, the reason that people often get this wrong, is that they mistake how many people they already know don't have the illness. And so if a person tests positive, then it's much more likely that they've tested positive because the test in this case is given a false positive, rather than because it's given the correct result. So this is known as the base rate fallacy. So those of you who got it wrong, you should not feel dispirited by this, because it turns out that this test originates in a psychological experiment done on staff and students at the Harvard Medical School, an elite medical institution, most of whom said 95%. So while you shouldn't feel dispirited, you probably should feel rather worried if you ever have to seek medical treatment in America. Okay, so that's the first example to sort of try to convince you that we do reason badly. And this is exactly the sort of reasoning that we do in science. This is part of the methodology of science. We reason under uncertainty. We use statistical evidence to try to support particular hypotheses. In this case, the hypothesis was Jane is ill or Jane is not ill. We're trying to decide between the two. We have uncertain evidence. We weigh up our evidence and try to come to a level of confidence. But of course, it needn't be those. It could be a particular scientific hypothesis that we use. But it turns out we're bad at that sort of thing. But in that particular case, I sort of gave you an intuitive reason for thinking that sort of reasoning is wrong and that there's a better sort of reasoning to use. In the next case, which I want to come on to now, I'm going to try to do a little bit more than that. I want to try to tell you, first of all, what the general principle is underlying our reasoning that it turns out we go wrong with, but then also try to tell you how we go wrong. Okay. So here we go, Jane, I'm afraid, again. Highly involved in these experiments. So you're going to be told something about a person called Jane, and this is what you're going to be told. You're going to be told at university Jane was very politically active. She was involved in CND protests. She campaigned against the Vietnam War, and so on. And then you're asked to consider two different claims that people might make. The first one's this: Jane is an accountant and a political activist. I'll call that A. And here's the second one, B. Jane is an accountant. Separate claim. So again, pop quiz. The question now is, which one are you more confident in? Are you more confident in A than B or B than A? So who's more confident in A than in B? Don't be shy. Okay, good. Who's more confident in B than in A? Okay, so you guys are really atypical, it turns out. So it turns out that in the experiments originally done on this, on less well-informed subjects than yourself, but nonetheless college graduates, I should say. I mean, I'm sort of making out the reason that you guys are better at this is because sort of a lot of people who have been involved with the university and sort of interested in education generally, but this was originally done on college graduates, and most people, it turned out, said they believed the first one, and Jane's an accountant and a political activist, more strongly than they believed the second one. So this was a study done by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman in the early 80s. Kahneman now sort of gaining popular recognition through a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, where he describes a lot of the work that he did on these cognitive failures or reasoning failures that people are susceptible to. Okay, so this is sort of trying to motivate the idea that a lot of people do get this sort of thing wrong. I mean, very simplistic sort of probabilistic reasoning, but they get it wrong. What's wrong about it? Well, the first sort of first stab at what's wrong about it is that the first claim is a stronger claim than the second one. It says more. It's going to be true in fewer situations. It's going to be true in situations where Jane's an accountant and a political activist, where the second one, all that's required is that she's an accountant for it to be true. So it seems a stronger claim you should give less credence to. You should be less confident in something that ends up saying more. And that's pretty good. That's a not too bad first guess at what's wrong with rating, or with saying that you believe A more strongly than B. Being vulnerable to what they call the conjunction fallacy. This is what this particular fallacy is called. But I'm going to try to present a little bit of what's done in philosophy to try to make more precise what's wrong with someone who commits the conjunction fallacy, someone who reasons badly in this respect. Okay, so there are sort of two answers I'm going to present. The first is the sort of orthodox standard answer that philosophy gives in this case. But I don't think it's that great. And I'm then going to offer a sort of alternative answer that I've been sort of interested in this particular answer and how it extends to other sorts of reasoning. Okay, so here goes the standard sort of answer about this. What's wrong with having certain sorts of levels of confidence? Well, this answer says this. One of the things that our levels of confidence or degrees of belief or strengths of belief, one of the things that those do is they guide action. They lead you to make certain choices one way or the other. So how confident you are of a particular thing will determine how likely you are to make choices that are dependent on the truth of that thing. So in particular, it will determine which sort of betting situations you're likely to get into. So let's take a particular person who might commit the conjunction fallacy. So, for instance, that person might be 70% confident that Jane's an accountant and an activist, but only 50% confident that she's an accountant. So they commit this reasoning fallacy. So what's wrong with them? So this answer that I'm considering says that what's wrong with those degrees of belief is it leads you to accept certain betting situations as ones that you want to enter into. What are these betting situations? Well, there's just two of them. And the first one is a bet that's going to pay you back £10 if it turns out that Jane's an accountant and she's an activist, and it pays you nothing if not. And the question is, well, how much money would you pay to someone? How much money would you be prepared to pay to someone to enter into that situation, that betting situation? And the thought is, if you're 70% confident in that claim, you should pay £7 to enter into that sort of bet. You should consider that a fair price for the bet. The general sort of feeling that the more confident you are, clearly the more you would pay to enter into that sort of bet. And the idea of this claim is that it's precisely £7 that you would pay to enter into that. Take the second bet. This is just going to be a bet on the other claim, claim B that we were interested in. So the claim that Jane's an accountant, and this is a bet that's going to pay out £10 if she is an accountant and £0 otherwise. But this bet, I'm not going to ask you to pay money to enter into, but I'm asking you to sell this bet instead. I'm asking you how much money you would accept from someone to become the bookie, the person who has to give out £10 if Jane's an accountant but doesn't have to give out anything if she's not. Well, again, the idea is if you're sort of 50% confident that Jane's an accountant, how much money would you accept from someone to enter into this situation? Well, £5. That seems like a fair sort of price given your levels of confidence. So you're prepared to buy that first bet and you're prepared to sell the second bet. But it turns out if you do that, you're in bad trouble. The reason is, entering into those bets may individually have seemed fair when you considered how confident you are in the relevant claims and then just considered the bet on their own. But when you consider the two bets together, it's going to turn out that regardless of whether Jane's an accountant or not, regardless of whether she's an activist or not, however the world turns out, you're going to lose money. Different amounts of money, depending on how the world is, but nonetheless, you're going to lose money. So here are the three possibilities. Suppose Jane's an accountant and she's an activist. Well, you've given the person £7 to enter into the first bet, taken £5 in to sort of be the bookie in the second bet, so your net gain at the moment is you're down £7, then £5 given to you, so you're down £2 at the moment. And if she's an accountant and an activist, then you're going to win, the first bet's, you're going to get money in the first bet. So you're going to win the first bet. But you're going to lose the second bet, you're going to have to give out money. So you're going to bring in £10, you're going to have to give out £10. So your net gain is you're £2 down. What if she's an accountant and not an activist? Well, in that situation, again, you've sort of had to pay out £7, you've brought in £5. But if she's an accountant and not an activist, then you lose bet 2, so you have to give out the £10. So now you're down £12, and in the final situation, it turns out that you give out £7, you bring in £5, but then neither bet sort of either pays out. So you're down £2. So here's what's wrong with being someone who's more confident in the claim that Jane's an accountant and a political activist than you are just in the claim that she's an accountant. What's wrong with you, according to this answer, is that you will be led by having those degrees of confidence, those levels of confidence, to enter into certain sorts of actions. You'll be led to do certain sorts of things. But those certain sorts of things you can know ahead of time. Without knowing anything about what the world's like, you'll just know for certain that you're going to end up losing money. And that you might think is just an irrational situation to be in. So what's wrong with these levels of confidence on this view is not really the levels of confidence themselves, but rather the actions that they lead you to perform, the things that they sanction as good things to do. This is the whole story. So, there's an extent to which I buy this argument. There is something irrational about entering into a situation where you could know up front, without knowing anything about the world, that you'll lose money. That's irrational, no doubt about it. But it doesn't seem to capture everything that's irrational about those sort of levels of confidence. Because you sort of imagine some sort of person, perhaps a robot, or a person with some sort of medical condition, which means that they just cannot make actions based on their levels of confidence. Nonetheless, you don't want to say that they're now rational just because those actions that they would have been led to by these levels of confidence are now no longer open to them. There still seems to be something wrong with them, just in terms of how they represent the world as being. They're more confident in something which makes a stronger claim than in something that makes a weaker claim. That just seems to be wrong, regardless of how those levels of confidence feed into the actions they perform. So what is wrong with it? So I'll quickly try to sketch my answer to what's wrong with people like that, what's wrong with agents like that. So the idea is to try to understand what it is that you're trying to do when you have beliefs. What is it that an agent does when she has beliefs about the world or has levels of confidence in the world? Well, she's trying to represent the world in a particular way. She's trying to create a sort of true story about how the world is that responds well to the evidence that she has. And I'm going to claim that what we want to do is measure how good a particular person is with respect to that goal, the goal of representing the world well. And then I'm going to claim that what goes wrong with an agent like that is that they fall short of that goal in some important way. So we're going to take our lead from ethics to some extent, which is something that's not done terribly much in epistemology, but that's how we're going to work. So one thing we think in ethics is we measure how good we are by how far we fall short of perfection. Okay? So how good you are is how close your actions come to being the sort of actions that a moral saint might perform. Not saint in a religious sense, saint in a sort of morally, a moral sense, that they always do the right thing. So how good you are is how close you come to approximating a saint. And the suggestion is perhaps we should do exactly the same thing in the methodology of science, or the epistemology of science. We want to find what an epistemological saint is, what it would be to be perfectly good with respect to representing the world, and then measure how good we are by how close we come to approximating that. And the question is, what is epistemic sainthood? How do you get epistemic sainthood? And the answer is, you're omniscient. That's the only sort of thing that gets epistemic sainthood. It's the only thing that's perfectly good, epistemically speaking. It's the thing that perfectly represents the world, is an omniscient agent. So, here are the different levels of confidence that an omniscient agent would have in the different situations that are relevant. Suppose Jane is an accountant and an activist. Well, the omniscient agent would be 100% confident in the first claim, 100% confident in the second claim, because they know everything, so they perfectly represent the world in that situation. What if she's an accountant and not an activist? Well, the first claim there is false, so omniscient agent would have 0% confidence in it. Second one's true, so they'd have 100%. And then, if she's not an accountant, both of them are false, so the omniscient agent is 0% confident in both. Great. Now, we're going on to pictures. So what we want to do, and what I'm going to do now, is represent those different omniscient agents and the different possibilities pictorially. And then we're going to see what goes wrong with someone who violates this, who commits the conjunction fallacy. So here's how we do it pictorially. We draw a box, and we're going to say, we're going to plot particular agents as points within this box. And up the vertical axis, the y-axis, I suppose, you're going to plot how confident they are in the first claim, that Jane's an accountant and she's an activist. So that goes between 0 and 100%. So the higher up there the dot is, the more confident the agent is in that. And along this way, we're going to plot how confident she is, the person is in the claim that Jane's an accountant. So the further along you are, the more confident you are in that. So let's now start plotting our omniscient agent. So the one where Jane isn't an accountant, a world where that's true, our omniscient agent's 0% confident in both of them, so they're that yellow dot down at the bottom. What about the world in which she's an accountant and she's not an activist? Well, in that case, the first one's false and the second one's true, so she's 0% confident in the first one, 100% confident in the second one, so she's along there. And then finally, in the situation where they're both true, she's 100% confident in both of them. Great. So those are our omniscient agents, those 4 yellow dots. They represent our different omniscient agents and different possible ways that the world could turn out to be. And now the next thing to do is to draw this triangle. What does this represent? This represents people who satisfy the norm of rationality, the rational principle that we're trying to justify. So people who commit the conjunction fallacy are up in that top left triangle. Okay? Why? Because they're more confident in the proposition that's represented on the vertical axis than they are in the one that's represented along the horizontal one. So if you're outside that nice red square, nice red triangle, then you're committing the conjunction fallacy. You believe the first thing more than you believe the second thing. Okay, so what's wrong? There's someone who does it. Okay, maybe they're, I don't know, 30% confident that Jane's an accountant and something like 60% confident that she's an accountant and an activist. So they do the wrong thing. What's wrong with them? Well, here's one thing that's wrong with them. Consider this alternative person. So suppose I'm here, I'm the one up there committing the conjunction fallacy, and James is the second dot, okay? And he's doing the right sort of thing, okay? He's sort of equally confident that Jane's an accountant as he is that she's an accountant and an activist, and that's a rational thing to do. So there's James there. Now, it turns out that there's something about James that I just know for sure is better than me. He's closer to all of the different omniscient agents than I am. So, look, there's the first one. So look how far I am from that omniscient agent. James is closer. That's just Pythagoras' theorem. What about that omniscient agent? Again, James is closer. And what about that one? Again, James is closer. Now, I didn't need to learn anything new about the world in order to find out that James is better than me in this respect. I just, because this is true regardless of whether Jane's an accountant, whether she's an activist or not, it's true that James is closer to that world, closer to perfection, closer to what the omniscient agent would do than I am in those situations. So there's something irrational about me. So we've identified what's irrational about me. Moreover, people who don't commit the conjunction fallacy, people who are in that nice red triangle, they don't suffer from this problem. There's no other person whose levels of confidence are closer to perfection than theirs are, regardless of how the world turns out. So this is a sort of general strategy. It's quite a recent strategy. For the last 15 years, people have been trying to apply this in epistemology and general sort of methodology of science. It's trying to identify what epistemic perfection is, identify some sort of measure of the distance that people might lie from epistemic perfection, and then justify principles of rationality on the basis of that. Okay? So in this one, I've justified by saying, well, if I violate this principle of rationality, if I'm more confident in Jane's an accountant and an activist than I am in the claim that she's an accountant, then I know there's someone like James who's better than I am, closer to perfection, regardless of how the world turns out. And it turns out this is quite a fruitful strategy for sort of trying to justify these principles of rationality. Okay, so just want to try to give a sort of flavor of the general questions in philosophy of science that we're interested in, as well as these sort of very particular questions that John and Eleanor and David have been talking about. Both are sort of extremely important, and of course there will be some of these problems, particularly maybe the case about illness and tests for it, that are maybe particularly relevant in one of those philosophies of. Maybe in that case, philosophy of medicine it's particularly relevant for. But there are also sort of general canons of reasoning, sort of reasoning under uncertainty, like the sort that I've been talking about. They're used in all areas of science. And this sort of approach is one way that we might try to justify those principles. But in general, that's one of the things that we try to do in philosophy of science. Thanks very much.